Welcome to The War at Home, Then and Now. This is Episode 1, a conversation with co-director Glenn Silber. Let's listen in. All right, so we're talking about The War at Home, which is our documentary film about the 1960s and early 70s anti-war movement. And, it's a film I made with Barry Alexander Brown. And it's sort of amazing that the film ever got made at all. We were very, very young, in our early to mid 20s. And, I'd gone to school at the University of Wisconsin. I got there in 1968. And it was already a very kind of hotbed of anti-war protest. It'd been going on for a few years already. And I was trying to pay attention to what was happening. It was a very exciting time, but I had to really learn what was going on. I was recruited into a meeting about the draft in 1968 and what it meant to students who could be sent to Vietnam. And it was that experience that happened to me really from 1968 through 72 when I finally graduated that had totally transformed me as a young person, as someone who came into the college with a very naive attitude and really didn't know anything about anything. By the time 4 years later it had transpired, I guess I considered myself definitely an anti-war activist, a bit of a radical. And I also really wanted to become a documentary filmmaker. So it was those sort of two impulses that led me into deciding I wanted to make this film. Now, I had no experience to speak of as a filmmaker and I had no resources. But what compelled me was I was completely convinced that my generation, both at the University of Wisconsin, where I went to school, and hundreds of other colleges around the country had gone through this transformative experience. And all the millions of hours that went into trying to understand the war in Vietnam and the actions that were taken against it, because we learned it was such a wrong-headed war to be involved with. And it was just hundreds of thousands of men being sent over there, that it just felt that we'd been through this experience. It was so meaningful to us. There hadn't been any films made about the anti-war movement. And at that point, I made a decision as a graduate, as a young, really wannabe documentary filmmaker, that this would be my big obsession. And I would find a way to make this film. So I didn't know exactly how to go about it, but I reached out to a famous radical filmmaker named Emil D'Antonio, who had already made a lot of great, important political films. And I tracked him down in New York and told him what my idea was. And he was very generous with his time. And he sort of took me under his wing. And he said, Glenn, that's a great idea. Even though the war has just been over a few years, it would be great to show how millions of people in this country eventually banded together. But I think your idea about doing it from the University of Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin point of view is really the best part of it, because you don't want to be running around from one coast to the other coast saying this happened and that happened. In other words, you don't want to be a mile wide and an inch deep in telling your story. So what I recommend is that you really go back to Madison, get deeply into your research, try to figure out what type of material exists, whether it's film or photos or whatever. And then, I'll stay in touch with you and I'll be like a mentor toward you. So I thought he was going to make the film. I just wanted to be like an associate producer. And now he's turning it on me, kind of giving me this assignment. And it was one that I fully embraced, which was a little unusual since I hadn't really made a full length feature documentary before and I had zero money or resources to draw on. But when you make a decision that you want to do something and you really see it in your own mind and you understand the story you're trying to tell, because I'd already lived in Madison for 5 years at that point, I just committed to it. And then, amazingly, I wound up finding a treasure trove of footage, and I hired Barry Alexander Brown, to be my film researcher. And eventually we became partners. And 4.5 years later, we actually finished the film. I don't think anyone ever thought we were going to even finish it, or if we did, it would be very good. But that story is a whole nother story about how the film premiered and kind of
It was like a lightning bolt hit the theater, hit the cinema, and we made a film that was widely accepted as an authentic expression of the 1960s anti-war movement. And 40 plus years later, it's still pretty much the only film on that subject that's exclusively focused on that story. And I'll tell you a little more about that later, okay?
We look forward to that. The War at Home, Then and Now is a Virtuoso production. Music by Studio 584 Incorporated. Visit the website www.thewaratHome.tv to learn more about the film.